Please be seated. Good evening. Love your enemies. Do not resist an evildoer. Although we hear much the same message in our reading this evening from the Bhagavad Gita, that doesn't make the message go down any easier. It is the ultimate tough passage to apply when you are cut off in traffic or you are asking a favor from a bureaucrat who obviously hates his job. But this passage, if you recognize the approach, is a key to a lighter load in this life. Speaking of lighter loads, I want to talk to you about gravity for just a moment. About 100 years ago, one of the world's most produced plays in its various versions opened in London. It is called Peter Pan. One feature of the play, and you can't mount the play without it, is flying children. The children are told to think happy thoughts, and they are lifted off the stage by unseen wires. If you have seen this in live performance, the effect is nothing short of astonishing. Within days of the play's opening, children all over London were thinking happy thoughts and throwing themselves from beds, from tables, from bureaus, staircases, and windows, until the playwright, James M. Barrie, was directed to write the flying children out of the play as a matter of public safety. Barrie was not about to discard the magic of his creation, so he came up with magic dust that was also needed in order to fly and was only available to the children in the play. So the dropping children of London came to an end. Now, this approach, happy thoughts and magic dust, is not the way to deal with gravity. We neither resist gravity by jumping out of windows, nor ignore it by jumping out of windows. It is a force of nature. We do not wake up on certain days and tell ourselves, "Today is my gravity-free day." We don't complain to our neighbors about the gravity. But what about evil and enemies? Do we sometimes pretend that we can remove them from the world or that they just aren't there? When I was maybe 12 years old, my grandmother gave me one of my grandfather's sermons to read. This was at her house in Vermont, which contained secret chambers, camping equipment, canoes, air rifles, and Granny gives me a sermon. But I read it. It was on the nature of evil. My grandfather was the Episcopal Church in Chester, Vermont, and had passed away a short time before I was born. This particular sermon he had written because somebody in Chester had died, probably taking his own life. The text for the sermon was what we read in the gospel this evening: love thy enemies. But while we always concentrate on the downside of this verse, why would we coddle evil people? My grandfather focused completely on how this message affects us, the people dealing with their enemies, and how this message can lift our burdens, even for someone whose spirit has been crushed. Evil, whether it is embodied in a supernatural being, or a disembodied force in the universe, or merely the result of everyone having free will, we end up in the same place. It is always with us. No matter how many happy thoughts and how much magic dust we use. But unlike gravity, which has rules, evil, or Satan, if you will, doesn't follow any rules. And that takes evil away from reasoned investigation. In fact, the greatest achievement of Satan, it has been said, may be that the conventional world is convinced that he does not exist. But evil is always in the world, and its instruments are your enemies, who are who? In the ancient world, your enemies were those who lived differently than you, and not to oppose them, not to sever all connection with them, not to pass judgment on them, was perceived to be directly contrary to your tribe, the state, and the law of God. This guaranteed a rich supply of enemies to prove your strength and integrity, remove trust, and build tensions and stress. We, unfortunately, are not that far away from this condition today. Jesus asks that we not throw ourselves into every confrontation we can possibly have with an enemy, but rather to accept them. Look at Christ's example in his meeting with Satan. We know the story. Jesus went into the wilderness, and just as the 40 days were up, he meets Satan. The meeting is almost courtly. They spar a bit by trading scriptural references. Jesus finally points out that Satan has stepped over the line, and Satan withdraws. Through the whole meeting, Jesus acts with restraint and class, almost as if these two were rivals with mutual respect, who ran into each other at the club. Who knew that our dear Lord was Episcopalian? How much power should we allow someone else to have over us? Well, when we hate someone, their power is total. A sentence made its way over the internet recently. Someone just honked to get me out of my parking spot faster, so now I have to sit here until both of us are dead. That isn't far from the case. When we oppose our enemies through hate, we bind ourselves to them, and they, or evil in general, wins. That's exactly how evil, or the devil, wants it. It is how we become consumed. Jesus directs a different approach altogether, not to oppose enemies, not to disregard them by running or pretending we can fly and our enemies can't touch us, but to engage them, accept them, understand them, and cut them some slack. And when you decide to love your enemies in this way, you will not believe how the power of an enemy, being a person or a task or guilt or fear, simply melts away. It is almost like getting your life back. But there is one enemy we must strive daily to love before all others. And this enemy was my grandfather's main concern. Of all the people in the world who can do you the most harm, do the most to hold you back and to undercut your hopes, it is you. You can create enemies and obstacles which are not there. You may give up on yourself after your first mistake or failure in an endeavor far more easily than you would ever give up on a friend. If you are not accepting yourself, understanding yourself, if you are not cutting yourself the same amount of slack that you would just for a stranger, you are doing the devil's work, and he doesn't need the help. Even when provoked, Christ wants you to treat your enemy with common decency and respect. Make it clear to them, and maybe yourself, that there's no harm done. And don't just do that because it will get on their nerves, but because it frees you. The enemy will do what they're going to do, but you have done your best and can hold your head up. In a very strange way, living such a life, accepting, and in some way that's very hard to say, embracing everything that comes at you and goes wrong, we are much more alive and happier. If we can handle gravity, we can handle evil.